Okay, so this presentation is going to be about infrastructure as code, what the options are in 2021. It's going to be very AWS centric, since that's kind of the cloud that I'm really focused on. But I want to cover a couple things. First of all, I just want to talk about a little bit of a short history. We won't take long with that. But we'll get into 2021. And then finally, I want to touch on my thoughts for going forward. What will I be using for infrastructure as code? Okay, so back in the early days, you could go into the console and write Lambda functions directly into AWS's browser-based console. That's pretty much never a good idea. And definitely isn't infrastructure as code. Really, the option was using CloudFormation. CloudFormation, however, is a beast. There's an awful lot of heavy lifting to be done. I've never gone through the process of really becoming completely comfortable with that. However, from what I understand, that has gotten easier over time. But not too long after the introduction of AWS, there were some, I can't remember what I used initially, because I started using Lambda probably a week or so after it was publicly announced. And well, I guess what I mean by publicly announced, I mean it had come out of beta. But the serverless framework came around pretty early on, and it was a huge step forward for deploying resources to Amazon. It allowed you to take a YAML configuration, and that configuration was relatively straightforward. It made a lot of sense. It helped you not only deploy Lambda functions, but all the other resources that AWS provided. In fact, it was multi-cloud. So it did start out with AWS, but soon it was basically able to publish with somewhat different syntax, but with the same basic ideas in place to any of the major cloud providers. So yeah, serverless framework as a deployment framework, as an intermediary between AWS and CloudFront, between you and CloudFront, was a huge benefit. And it was very popular, still remains very popular. And as a result, it developed this rich ecosystem of plugins. So not only was the core framework kind of kept up to date, which is critical because obviously the cloud is not a stationary target, but also a whole bunch of third-party plugins came in to address specific needs that helped out. Now, if we go into 2021, I think the obvious comparison point to the serverless framework is AWS SAM. These two are pretty much like for like. I think AWS or Amazon recognized that what the serverless framework was doing made a lot of sense, and so this is their attempt at that. And Amazon puts out a lot of content. I don't always find their content to be fantastic. Some of it's good. However, when they give examples, they either use the console, which I find to be not useless, but not really what I'm looking for. Or now, of course, they're using SAM as their examples. So there's becoming more and more example templates and so on using AWS SAM. But that's not it. And these two other options I knew very close to nothing about until recently. But AWS Amplify, and I've not done anything with Amplify, so if anyone knows better, this might be not completely correct, but basically Amplify is a way to address the whole front to back stack. So it provides a way for you to use a modern SPA framework like React, Vue, Angular, whatever, and then connect it right through to the back end. And it simplifies some of the kind of complications of DynamoDB. It brings incognito for security and authentication, and it does a lot of things. But it's intended to provide a kind of simple front to back path, and so I don't really know exactly how to describe its strengths and weaknesses in terms of just infrastructure as code. I have considered doing a little pet project with Amplify, but I so far have not, and I don't have a strong desire to. I see it kind of as being a competitor, if anything, to something like a Firebase stroke Google Cloud offering, allowing people to move fairly quickly towards building this front-to-back application. And then kind of moving in the other direction is the AWS CDK. And up to now, everything is kind of configuration-based. So although we say infrastructure as code, really in most cases it's infrastructure as configuration. AWS CDK kind of takes the term infrastructure as code more literally and provides you a set of programming languages. The idea is that if you're a TypeScript user, you can use TypeScript to write your infrastructure. If you're using JavaScript, the same thing, Python, and I think there's a fourth. I think the idea is to basically have all the primary languages that are supported in the Lambda runtimes also available in the AWS CDK. So this could be quite powerful. In fact, it is very similar to something that I myself have developed over the years. So I've been using the serverless framework since it came out, and the name DevOps framework is something I recently just put a name to it. But basically, I'm really a big fan of TypeScript and a big fan of strong typing. So what we developed was a set of TypeScript configuration, which was configuration stroke code. And that TypeScript code and configuration allowed you to kind of provide good guardrails, forced you to only configure what you could configure, what was allowed. It also allowed you to be dynamic, put in a little bit of programmatic logic based on environment variables or whatever you want. We built step functions. The step functions are great, but building a step function is problematic, and it can easily lead. You can make syntactic mistakes and not realize that until you try to publish it. And with a step function, you have to publish the entire repo. You have to do a full deployment, and as a result, a mistake there can be quite costly. With this DevOps framework, you really know at design time whether the step function is configured right or not. And for that reason, it feels like a big add-on to the serverless framework. But just to be clear, it's not trying to compete with the serverless framework at all. It actually is just something that sits in front of the serverless framework. It uses strong typing and basically builds to a serverless YAML file and then uses the serverless framework to push through to CloudFormation and then AWS. So ironically, this is, my ambition this weekend was really to get rid of some of the kinks and rough edges to this DevOps framework, and really start using it in earnest. I mean, I've been using it for a couple of years now, but I started to read about the AWS CDK, and I don't know why when I first heard about the CDK, I kind of dismissed it as something that I wouldn't be interested in. But as I started looking at more information about it, I started to see that in many ways there's quite a lot of similarities between the AWS CDK and what we've developed. So that's left me in a bit of a funny position because I feel like the serverless framework has provided an amazing amount of value over the years. I also somewhat worry that with AWS clearly investing in their own frameworks, that could end up really hurting the momentum behind serverless framework. And where I can, as an entrepreneur and kind of technologist, I always want to try to leverage the tools of big providers like AWS where I can, instead of trying to create my own stuff. So I have to say that my first impression of the SAM templates was I didn't like them quite as much as the serverless framework, but I'm not sure yet if that's purely an outcome of me not being as familiar with them. I will say that, the serverless framework's longevity and that whole third-party ecosystem is a nice plus, and I think that, again, I think I probably will have to invest a little bit more time in understanding SAM and CDK options a bit more before I make definitive judgments on this for my work. But one thing that I did notice is that in that serverless frameworks, oops, that's not what I meant to do. In that serverless frameworks third-party plugin set, one of them is something called Serverless SAM, and what it actually lets you do is, if you can publish a serverless YAML file, that plugin will convert it into an AWS SAM file, and that's interesting because there are offerings in the testing space like serverless offline. That's something you get if you're using the serverless framework. However, Amazon has come up with a fully, a Docker-based offline environment, and if they put the right resources into it, that could really develop into something quite impressive. If the serverless SAM plugin works, I can basically continue to do what I'm doing effectively and have my choice between serverless framework or AWS SAM, whichever one suits me best. The CDK is a bigger step away from that, but I do like, first of all, I like the fact that they support TypeScript, and there's everything that in their CDK, I believe, is strongly typed. So that just takes a burden off me. I've been kind of maintaining a set of typings for a while now for AWS, which I won't need to anymore if I was to move in that direction. However, I have to say that, the way that they've approached it, I don't immediately see it as a simplification at all. I think it could be if you decide to make it into a simplification, if you build the right abstractions, but providing code versus a configuration file just gives you infinite number of directions you can move in, and could lead to some operational risks that maybe are accounted for in a more manageable way through a configuration-based approach. So, in summary, is less is more. Oftentimes, I have to say that the earlier days were simpler, and that is attractive to me in some regards. I'm not sure it's better. I think it's probably good to have choice here, but that's made more credible by the fact that AWS is clearly investing. They're investing in these frameworks, but they're investing in pushing out content. I feel like the amount of content they've been pushing out has definitely been increasing. And I don't think that should be ignored. Now, I think everyone's most impressed with their own work, or at least there's a risk that that's the case. And I might be falling into this. However, I do think that having spent the time this weekend just kind of think through the different options here, I still lean most strongly towards what we already have. And I think that the only caveat to that is that we really do need to keep our eyes on both SAM and CDK, in particular CDK. CDK, to me, is a more interesting option for the mid to long term. So that's my thoughts. I'm still going through a learning curve. If anyone has any insights that they'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. And until then, good luck with your infrastructure as code.